Nebraska Health and Human Services has granted a radioactive license to Creighton University. This allows individuals with documentation of training to handle radioactive materials for medical or educational purposes and for research and development. They have asked that all individuals who enter labs authorized for radioactive work have a basic safety orientation. That is the purpose of this training. This is not the initial or refresher training that radiation workers must complete. This is designed for those individuals who may frequent a radioactive lab but do not handle radioactive materials. To receive credit for this training, you must provide the information requested on the following slides. There are two types of restricted labs where radiation is used. Some researchers have machines capable of producing X-rays. Other labs have materials or chemicals that are labeled with radioactive atoms known as isotopes. This presentation will mainly focus on material laboratories, but most information will be pertinent to both types of research. Laboratories approved for radiation work can be identified by the trifoil symbol, which is usually magenta on a yellow background. This symbol resembles a propeller, and many people refer to it as a propeller symbol. The presence of this sign does not mean that you will automatically be exposed to radiation by entering the area. It is merely a warning that the lab may contain radioactive materials or radiation-generating equipment, and there is a potential for exposure. The key to being safe in these areas is communication. Ask the lab workers if it's okay to enter. They will know if radiation exposure is a current concern. When radioactive materials or equipment are not being used, they will be stored safely to minimize potential exposure. Be mindful of areas within the materials laboratories which have the trifoil symbol posted, such as hoods, sinks, waste containers, or equipment. These items may be contaminated and should not be touched, moved, or used without authorization from the laboratory workers. On the door to all radioactive material labs, there is a sticker that says absolutely no food or drink allowed. No one is allowed to have any food product inside the lab at any time. If you enter a lab with coffee, candy bar, or any other food item, the trained staff in the lab will ask you to leave. This restriction has recently been expanded to include chewing gum. Cosmetics are also forbidden in the radioactive labs. State authorities can even cite Creighton University for evidence of food in the lab. They do not need to see you consume it. If they were to find items like candy wrappers or paper cups in the wastebasket, Creighton could be given a notice of noncompliance. If you need to use an item in your research that resembles a food container, for example, a styrofoam cup, you must label it as not for food consumption. Any equipment used for radioactive material research will have the trifoil symbol affixed to it. This symbol will be in a conspicuous location on the device. You will not have to look for it. Again, this symbol does not mean that the equipment will always be contaminated. It just means that the equipment could be contaminated. The workers are expected to decontaminate any equipment after use, but it is possible the process will not have been completed. To be safe, talk to lab workers and get their assurance that you may use the equipment without spreading contamination. Equipment with the trifoil symbol should never be moved to another lab without prior permission from the Radiation Safety Office. There are strategies to minimize occupational radiation exposure. First, reducing time spent in the vicinity of radioactive materials will decrease your exposure. Second, use distance as an advantage. Radiation exposure follows the inverse square law. If you can double your distance, your exposure will be 1/4 of what it was initially. Triple your distance and your exposure is 1/9 of what it was. Sometimes standing farther away and reaching makes your work more difficult, thus increasing the time. You will have to balance these factors for each situation and determine the best way to minimize your exposure. The third strategy, shielding, is more complex. However, the fundamental rule is that placing something between you and the source will absorb some or all of the radiation. The appropriate shielding material will depend on the type of radiation emitted. Lead is not always the best shielding material. Radioactive material and waste are often stored in plexiglass, which is appropriate for some materials. Radioactive waste must be kept separate from non-contaminated waste. There is added expense to disposing of radioactive waste, and the cost would significantly escalate if mixed with hazardous or biohazardous waste. Be sure you dispose of items properly. Do not increase the volume of radioactive waste by adding non-contaminated waste. Those who are not radiation workers are not expected nor allowed to clean up radioactive spills. If you are in a lab where there is a spill or a leaking container, the radiation workers may clean it up themselves, or the Radiation Safety Office may be called to assist. If you see a leaking container with the radiation label, notify the lab manager or other radiation worker, or call the Radiation Safety Office immediately. In the event of a spill, please contact the Radiation Safety Office and remain nearby until you have been surveyed for contamination. If your clothing or shoes have been contaminated, it is necessary to prevent it from spreading to other areas. If you are not a trained radiation worker, please do not attempt to clean up any spills. Security of radioactive materials requires everyone to be vigilant. Security requirements have been included in the regulations for many years and require Creighton to keep radioactivity free from loss or theft. In order to maintain compliance with regulations, it is important to remember that Creighton policy requires all radioactive materials to be locked if no one is in them. If you are the only person in the lab and you need to leave, even for only a few seconds, you must shut and lock the door behind you. Also, any visitors to the lab, such as equipment maintenance services, must be accompanied at all times. It is important to note that Creighton services, such as facilities and public safety, are allowed to enter the labs unescorted and as needed. They have been sufficiently informed of the policies and procedures to safely carry on with their duties. If you need to evacuate a radioactive lab for any reason, your safety is the priority. We ask that you move to a safe location as quickly as possible. Be sure to close and lock the door behind you as you leave the lab. You should be aware of the quickest route to a safe location. Do not take any of the radioactive material with you. Leave it inside the lab. Everyone has the right to be safe while employed at Creighton University. Everyone also has a responsibility to help maintain the safe environment in the lab. If you are ever uncomfortable with the situation involving potential exposure to radioactive materials, please notify the Radiation Safety Office immediately. Your concerns will be confidential. We will investigate all concerns to the best of our ability. If you feel we have not adequately addressed your concern, you have the right to express that to the Radiation Safety Committee or the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services. It is a violation of the regulations to be aware of a noncompliance and not report it. Even if you do not know if it's a violation, please contact the Radiation Safety Office and allow us to determine the level of concern. There is a red 8.5 by 11 inch poster in all of the radioactive labs. You can identify it by the trifoil symbol in the upper left corner. The poster is a review of the information provided in this orientation. Please locate that poster and familiarize yourself with it. During an audit, you may be asked to locate it and asked if you have ever read it. If it does not answer your question, the bottom line contains our office telephone number. Please call us at any time with any concerns. If you find you will be working with radioactive materials or X-ray generating equipment, please contact the Radiation Safety Office for further instruction. Additional training will be necessary and dosimeter badges may be required to monitor your exposure. Thank you for listening to the Radiation Safety Orientation. Remember, this information does not authorize you to handle radioactive materials, but you may perform other duties in the labs where radioactive material is used.